First of all, thank you so much for being here today. Appreciate it. It's kind of good being able to meet folks, at least virtually. So it's good to you to be here today. And I just wanted to start talking about things like the adoption of AI and large language models in construction, and your experience with that, and kind of what you see as some obstacles, probably more that yet to be resolved. Because I You'll hear me say this several times. I don't like hype cycles because I think it leads to misinformation kind of out there about when things are going to happen, or when what has to happen next. So I'd kind of just want to get your view on it and kind of see where you're at with that.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. This obviously is a topic I have a lot of heart for. Um, it's funny, the hype cycle thing, isn't it crazy that it happens and then it happens and then it happens, and people know they're in the middle of one, and yet it's like everybody gets handed a sheet of music and they say, I guess we're singing this today.
Hmm.
Yeah, so the thing about this round of AI, because AI has been around since the 60s, and it keeps coming, and then it fades away, then it comes and it fades away. This is the first time that real, like, non-specialists can use AI directly, and it does interesting things. That's kind of why it's been there's you've heard about it so much now. Whereas about 8, 9 years ago, there was another round of AI, and that was deep learning, and it wound up being the kind of thing that created a lot of features in other products. So, like, image recognition and facial recognition and voice that really worked for the first time, like voice recognition that really worked. But nobody was directly using it. They were using products that were based on it. Whereas ChatGPT, you can go straight into it and play with it. And I think people have a bad tendency to say, because it can do this and other things that can do this can also do that, before too long, it's going to be able to do that too. Do you see what I mean? People make this idea that things come in groupings, which they don't necessarily. So when you read something that is written and it reads like a PhD wrote it, doesn't mean a PhD that the AI can do all the things that a PhD could do. So we have a bad tendency of making assumptions that just because it can do one thing, that it can do other things that a human could do the first thing could do. The other thing, real quick, that I see is people see progress and they think it's going to be a straight line out till whatever, and nothing's ever a straight line. There's always diminishing returns. It always falls, like it goes as far as it can go, and then things get hard, and then we need to find another one and another one and another one.
Yeah, so I think this is good information in the fact that if you look up, I don't care if you did a Google search or even if you did your Chat GPT search of trends in the industry, right? Trends in construction technology, uh, you know, things that are happening. The first one, that's usually a competition between the two. It's either the labor shortage and how AI is going to be able to somehow help the labor shortage, or it's just AI itself and large language models being part of the construction world, and somehow going to ease the burdens of everybody out there. And I'm like, that's not going to do it, right? That's just not going. I think that's just terrible information, as it being some leading trend, because I think it's so far off.
I think people are hoping that people are hoping that it's going to be replacement for things people do, as opposed to a tool that helps them do what they're doing already. So I think, yeah, you're right in that there's a little bit too much riding on what AI can or can't do, and this time there's so much money going behind it that people can be forgiven for getting wrapped up in the hype. I mean, the amount of money that people are spending on training and data centers and all this is unbelievable. So much so that I'm sure you've seen people are talking about restarting nuclear power again, which had become so expensive and difficult that people, more or less, people we'd stopped really getting serious about it. And all of a sudden, there's a lot of interest in that, because how are we going to power all this stuff? Not whether it's nuclear or something else, we're going to have to figure it out. I think that the idea that software that is made better by AI can pull away some of the time waste, the drudgery of dealing with documents. I mean, this is a heavily documented industry, and people spend an awful lot of time shuffling through papers that were written in such a way that they're really hard to read. I mean, I've spent a lot of time in specifications, and I can tell you that specs are not particularly easy for a project team to read. Leaving aside the errors and the things that shouldn't be in there and all the rest of it, they're just hard. They're huge. They're written for the whole project. So at any given moment, you don't need most of what's in a spec. AI can help with that. Is it going to replace what people do? That's part of the question, I think, right now is everyone's hoping, I guess is maybe not the right word, but thinking that AI can take over, or AI, where it will be in some number of months or years, will be good enough to do the things that people do. And I just think that's like saying a jackhammer is going to be able to do what humans can do. A human plus a jackhammer can do something no human could ever do. It's certainly not in the time frames you're talking about, right? Why I chose a jackhammer, I don't know, top of mind. But you would never be saying a jackhammer is going to save our industry or solve our labor shortage. It just wouldn't even occur to you. Can one person get done what five people could get done with normal hammers or some sledgehammer? Yeah, absolutely. So that person can be more productive from one angle than another. But the reality is the industry is so complicated that where people hope AI will go, I think, is unrealistic, at least within a time frame we care about. And by that I mean, you know, you look at robotics as a subtype of AI, and the only robots I'm seeing that get real traction are ones that are able to operate in that rare moment when the environment is super simplified. Great example is layout robots, right? Well, you already needed to sweep the floor, which, like, when is the other time that things are cleaned up like that? The other
Right.
one that you see sometimes is, in some instances, rebar tying. Okay, but most of the time you're doing rebar, it's not useful. It's only when it's a bridge or there's certain instances, you know what I mean? And it's really great when those instances happen.
Yeah, well, it's really
But
great, but there's a hell of a lot of setup involved in that giant machine as
that's right.
well.
That's right.
I mean,
So there's these moments when there's enough to do where it justifies doing that, maybe. But you know, the point I'm making in all of this is the thing that makes construction special is how complicated everything is and how interconnected things are. And AI is particularly bad at that, and humans are particularly good at that in terms of understanding, well, if you do this, it's going to have an impact over there, and then so on and so forth. Or you can't do that because of X, Y, or Z. And AI is really bad at drawing those conclusions right now. And I don't see how it's going to get better in a time frame that we care about.
so I know that what you deal with a lot with the link, you talked about specifications, and that's kind of narrowing down the topic a little bit, right? But it is a big area. I know there's several times I can think of one job in particular I worked in the past where I think the architect said, "Well, you need to look at the spec book," and I said, "What spec book?" And he says, "Well, the one that was issued." And I said, "Which one?" Because there was three different ones issued. Nobody knew which one was which. And so that was my RFI to him at the very beginning of the job was and I said, which spec book, and then where would you be talking about in that spec book that this specific, and I can't remember what we were looking at. It was like a specific tile or some sort of something like that. So it's just kind of interesting as you say, spec books can be very difficult and to read, and you may need them for one thing and not another. So what have you done with that in order to is it, as far as the link goes, I'm kind of more interested in kind of what happens there.
Yeah, I mean, our goal is to make some of what you just talked about faster and easier, but in terms of assessing what's in there and pulling out things that you might choose to RFI and might choose not to. It's important to note that you shouldn't have a tool, whether it's AI or anything else, making decisions for you. It should be making decisions easier and faster because you don't have to go hunting for information. We started with a pretty simple thing, which is making submittal logs and closeout logs. And now we're going through and going deeper into it. The choice of what, if there's three spec books issued or whatever the story is, that's up to the manager to deal with. Like, AI is not going to take over for that. That's asking a tool to do a human's job. You know what I'm saying? So
Sure.
what we're looking at is how are you, let's think of it as like a stack almost of people, where at the top is really high level, like what are we doing here? And the next one is what are we doing next? And so on. AI is going to be down here. AI is going to be, I could trust a PE to go do this, or an intern to go do this, whether it's go hunt for a bunch of stuff and make me a list, which is really what a submit log is, or the 50,000 other things that you might pull from this, like find me all the standards, all the ASTM standards, so we can make sure we have them all, stuff like
Right.
that, right? Well, that's not nothing to automate that, but it's also not that magical. It's just saying, look, I want it to work. I want to be able to rely on it, and I want to be able to check it. Sometimes AI is the right tool to use, and others it's not. I'll give you an example. For most specs, AI is not the right way to make a submittal log. We tried, but it's not reliable enough. So it would wind up giving us different answers from the same spec section for like the same literal document.
Right.
It would say, oh, there's 5 this time, there's 7 that time. So we don't use AI for that. We use it for other things like summarizing or finding one thing or giving you an answer. And when you do, you want to be able to click through and see the underlying contract, the underlying document itself, so that you're sure that what it's giving you isn't a really well formatted hallucination, is the kind word that they use for it. There's other words that people have used.
Yeah.
So I think that it's important to keep in mind, AI is not digital people. This is another thing people get wrong, is they look at what it can do and think of it as a digital human, like it's a silicon brain. And that's really not what you should be thinking of. You should be saying, this is software that can do things other software can't, but it's still just software. It's still just code and a lot of math that's doing things. And as a result, it doesn't have all the things. There's no voice in AI's head, as we say, that says,
Mm.
hang on, this doesn't seem right. I mean, how many times in your career have you been saved by that little voice that says, hang on a minute, let's just take another look? Like this doesn't seem right, or let's double check
Right.
that. There's
Something's
none of that.
missing. Yeah, something's
That's right.
missing. We need to look at it again.
That's right. And that's what managers do. That's what experience and judgment. And I say this a lot, is that AI right now it's not even built for it. It's not even a question of give it more data. There's no version of it that has intuition, that has a model of how the world works, that is its way of saying, hang on a minute, that doesn't feel right. There's nowhere for it to go to say that doesn't feel right. And if you think about what makes people good at their jobs, it isn't that they know the steps in order. It isn't that they can go find something like in the beginning of their career, that's all they can do, is that they can look at things and say, I think this is the right next thing to do because I've done it a bunch of times, but also I have a sense of how the world works. And that's what I think should happen next. And there's no version of AI right now that can do that.
Yeah, and that leads me to my next thought about, thinking about scheduling, and because it talks about these things. So whenever I research this stuff, you research stuff, well, okay, what can it help with? Well, it's going to help with project management and scheduling and asset management. And I'm like, okay, can it? Right? Because obviously can it go by the data and say, hey, look, this crew over here can do X amount in X amount of hours or whatever by the data, and say, great. But it may not know that, such and such is missing from that crew who, drives that along, right? It's just a set of numbers. And so those are the things, when I see this, I feel like it's being a bit misleading when we look at, the data that's out there. These are reputable companies, the McKinseys of the world, the Deloittes, and those different groups that are Gartner. Those they gather statistics and data, and they say these are the new trends, and this is how it can help. But I think they're just they're way out there. They're kind of it seems a bit pie in the sky.
I think it's a mistake to trust anyone who isn't in an industry too much to talk about, where the future is going, and people love to do that. And I think they tend to be too abstract. They tend to be too far from the ground truth. And they have an incentive to overclaim because they want to create anxiety in their potential customers. So you go to them to help fix that anxiety. What do you call an outside consultant for? You do it because you think you don't have the staff in-house to handle the thing, either because you don't have enough people, which is rarely the thing, or because I need some smart person who's, he's published something or whatever. So we're going to call them up and they're going to help us out. And, legit, sometimes there is help, for sure. I used to work at AOL, and we brought in the McKinseys and the Accentures and all that, and they transformed the business and saved, literally, it's something like $2 billion a year in operating expenses. Okay, but that's not this. What you're talking about is these publications about, the tech ecosystem in construction and how all these things should fit together, and BIM needs to do this. And it isn't only about AI. They do this about a lot of things. And they make these sweeping statements about how things should or shouldn't be that I think miss what's really going on. An example for me that really helps is there's this tendency to talk about productivity. Wonderful. The problem is if you go to a project manager and say, I want you to do these things and I expect 5% increase in 5% increase in productivity, but there's a risk that there's going to be a claim in there. Well, one claim can wipe out whatever that increase was. So before anybody worries about getting better use out of people, they want to make sure that no one's getting hurt and nobody's doing stupid things that are going to wind up causing, a claim that you're going to have some issues anyway, or it's rework, or it's something else. So the point I'm making is you never hear people talking about the drivers of cost that are not productivity. They love to talk about productivity because it feels like that's where the value is. And I think just reducing rework on its own, like that's an enormous expense across the industry. And you hear them complain about it, but that's rarely what they talk about. So I don't know. I don't spend a lot of time with the McKinseys and the Gartners and so on. I think there's value in some things. Often they might think of use cases that okay, well, I'll consider that. But it's worth keeping in mind that AI on its own isn't going to be doing anything. AI as part of a product is going to do some things. It's going to help make software do what software does better, maybe do some new things. But without wrapping it with all of the guardrails and user interface and all the things that go into software, it's not going to be that useful. It's going to wind up being a toy or a cute little thing that you can do at office parties. To really be useful, you need to do a lot of other engineering to make it useful. So I think there's a lot of scope for AI to help, but it's making software better at what it already does, not on its own. And definitely, to the point you've made a few times now, it is augmenting the decision making of a human. It's not replacing it. Best it can do is offer up and say, hey, you might consider these things. God forbid, could you imagine if you were in a claim and the other lawyer, like the suing plaintiff's lawyer, came and said, hey, I'd like to subpoena your software, which they always do. And it turns out that a decision was made by AI and was uncritically followed, and that led to something. You're done. You're done.
Right.
So no one's going to do that, right? No one's going to trust that for a long time. And I think maybe certainly in an active live job site, I think it's going to be many years before AI isn't just giving advice and providing, just like Excel doesn't tell you where to spend money. It helps you to make decisions. This is just that with more flexibility and better able to deal with how messy the world is. That's the thing that AI is genuinely better at, is how messy the real world is. It's not as good as a human, but it's better than classic software. It's just it's a better version of classic software. It's not like a human that's faster but a little dumber. I just think that's a bad analogy.
Yeah, I think it acts as that. It's a bit of an accelerator to the performance of other software.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
It can make other software better because they can ask the questions to it faster. Right.
Well, and it can deal with inputs that are not great. A great example of that is before AI, voice recognition was really bad. I don't know if you ever used Dragon systems back in the day. This is like the 90s. But that was about as good as it got, and it was terrible. It had to get trained on your voice, and if you were speaking too fast, it would never work. Well, now we take for granted that you can speak to your phone, or you can speak to whatever, and it's pretty good. Better than Siri was in the beginning. Well, that's the kind of thing AI is awful good at. Certainly deep learning is taking inputs that are kind of fuzzy. Another one is you could never do the machine vision that we have now with anything other than AI, where no matter what the lighting is like, it's going to be pretty good at recognizing certain things. But nobody could recognize everything that people are promising it can recognize. And by that, I mean, there's software out there that says we'll be able to track how much has gotten done and all that. For drywall, that totally makes sense, kind of. Right. But what about electrical? Like, that's tough, because how much of that's hidden? How much of that is easy for somebody walking by it to really see? So I think but that speaks to construction a little bit, is in theory, sure. But the practical reality is to really inspect that or really understand that, you need to get over there and look and peel things over and look behind things. It isn't something a well-trained human couldn't just walk by, look at something and know quite as much as we need it to do. You see what I
Right.
mean? So
No, I
that's that
totally
disconnect.
understand. I watch Joe Rogan or listen to Joe Rogan on my drive time, but he was talking to Elon Musk about this, and he was talking about how he wanted to get the Samsung phone to take better pictures because they had better cameras on a Samsung phone to take better pictures of the moon, right? And it says you could blow it up to X amount size, and you could start to really see the features of the moon. Come to find out, Samsung engineers had to finally admit that what they were doing was they were taking the picture but they would then enhance it with AI photograph of the moon that were actually taken from space or something that was closer. That was making it up basically. It was making it look like it was this perfectly, this was the surface of the moon, and so these are the things. And I guess when you read maybe some of the stuff that I'm reading, maybe I'm not going to the right resources, which is why I like to talk with folks like yourself, because I don't think, I always say there's the information that you get for free and the information that you pay for. And so maybe I just need to pay for better information about what's actually going on with the development of AI, because I see a lot of worry in whether it's in an X thread or it's in somebody's talking about their stuff. My thing is and I've been saying this for a while. I feel like we're such a long way off, but in order to be prepared, you just have to have better data, and you have to be tracking your data. And I don't think that happens very well now in the industry itself. There are some reports, and you even reported it, I think it's in your book, that like 95% of the data that gets recorded is basically unusable.
Yeah, there's a lot in that statement you just made. First of all, I don't know what a long way off means because I don't know what there is. Like, what are we away? What are we off from? I think we're construction in 10 years is going to feel like construction now. Hopefully, less anxiety. Hopefully, a little bit better. When I say better managed, I don't mean to imply that people managing it right now aren't doing a good job. It's just I've heard a lot of people talk about how the demands on a contractor make it impossible to feel like we nailed it. Like, and they do.
Oh yeah.
But at the end of the day, it's like they look back and think of all the, panics and this and that. So I think that the pressures put on a project team at all levels, at the sub level, at the GC level, are beyond what you can really do a good job of without like lots of gray hair, like lots of anxiety. So I do think that that's an area it might get better. I think that the thing about data is there's two kinds of AI that are out there that matter. One, I mean, I say that there's two flavors. One is deep learning, and that's where you need a ton of data. And quite frankly, nobody has enough data to do anything but pretty simple stuff with deep learning. You know, uh, Turner doesn't have enough data, and they also don't have it all in one place. Because to
Mhm.
really do good things with deep learning, you need hundreds of thousands and millions of data points that are pretty close to each other. They all mean kind of the same thing, and they're nice and labeled and all that. Nobody but banks and people that are really transactional do that. Like insurance companies are good at that. Banks are, and retail, and so because they do the same thing millions of times, so they have all this
Mhm.
data. So I think the data thing is less relevant to generative AI, which you can just point at things. So you don't need to train it on anything. You point it at things and you give it guardrails and you ask it the right question and it'll do some things for you. The question is the underlying tech good enough yet to do things that are mission critical, or is it just going to help us with the things we trust an intern with? And at the moment, telling you it's just an intern. Whether and it's great for marketing, it's good for the first draft. This is the
Mhm.
other thing that I think people miss a little bit is it's very common that when a technology comes out, people want to put it in one place, but the market winds up finding way better uses for it somewhere else. And I think you're going to see that a little with AI here, that everyone is assuming it's going to do high level, high quality, high leverage stuff. Like it's going to look at our documents and tell us everything that's wrong with them. I think it'll start to indicate some things and it can find, inconsistencies and so on, but it's not going to make them perfect. What I do see it doing right now is it's a pain in the neck to write an agenda for a meeting. It's a pain in the
Mhm.
neck to summarize something, right? It's a pain in the neck to do the first draft of an email, especially when you got to write a lot of emails. So you're seeing it in marketing, you're seeing it in sales, you're seeing it in areas where a human already would be reviewing someone else's draft of something. So now it's just doing the draft and giving it to you. It's really nice to not have to do the first draft because, especially again, if you have to do 4 of them in a row or whatever, sometimes your head isn't in it. But it's pretty easy to be an editor, right? So what it's doing is transforming a lot of people who would be the only one doing the thing into
Mm.
a manager of something else doing the thing. That's real, and it saves real time and it saves real anxiety, especially when you don't like writing. It allows you to be a much better writer than you were and get a lot of things done that you other and again, I mean officey things, not really in the field sort of thing. I think right now there's a healthy skepticism of using AI for things that are mission critical or high risk. And I think that's appropriate. And it'll remain so for a while until we're in a different place than we are now. And I think that looking at AI as one thing is also kind of unhelpful. It's that's like saying software. Like there's some software that's fantastic, and there's some software that drives you nuts because it's either too complicated or it throws errors or it just isn't useful. That's going to be true with AI too. Is there stuff that's really useful? Like I said, if you got a meeting coming up and it's like throw me a draft, and you've got a presentation for that meeting, it can help you with it. It can help you write the whole thing, but it won't write it for you. It'll draft it and then you guide it, just like you had someone working for you. So this idea that you hear that AI is not going to take your job, it's someone using AI. Well, first of all, no one's taking anyone's job. It's just we don't have enough people already, and it's not like, you know what I mean. Like no one's
Mhm.
getting fired because they got pushed out by an AI. It's not within a time frame any of us care about. We're hungry for people. We're hungry for people with experience. But what I do think is that you'll be able to have people go home a little earlier. Like that's a valid hope, is that people are working hours that are more human. They're not doing paperwork after the kids go to bed. I've heard that so many times, or getting up early so they can double check things. So being able to kind of pull away some of the edges that aren't really the center of the job, but are the things that are necessary for the job, being able to simplify them and automate or semi-automate some of that stuff, that's a really good thing to look at. And I think you're definitely seeing that. You're seeing people do it on their own. You're seeing some companies put together, different software that can help. So I think it's worth putting it in the right place. And you started this by saying you don't like hype cycles, and that's the danger of a hype cycle is people end up at the sexy part that's ready for the movies way too early instead of saying, if this can mean that I ask somebody to look things up more often because they find it like that, right? Like hunting through a spec book, right? It's a pain in the neck, and Control F doesn't work as well as people wish it did, right? Well, AI is pretty good at finding stuff for you, especially if you can ask it again, right? Like it can be a conversation. Great, that's a PE who didn't spend 2 hours hunting for something. He found it as fast as I asked. That's great.
Right.
It did not transform construction. It just means that that young person can go and do 15 other things instead of hunting through specs for stuff that. And if you know it's that easy, you might look more often. Like that's another cool thing is that if I know it's that easy to follow the letter of what the contract says, then I'm going to do it more. I'm going to check more often. Like you look at maps, Google Maps. Like I use that for everything. And it's not
Yeah.
that I need it half the time. I kind of know where I'm going, but I don't have to think about it. I can think about other things. And if I'm a little bit unsure, I can just check. Well, it'd be nice if you can do that with the contract and some of the documents that are a real different headspace from walking a job and talking to people and solving 3D hard problems to then switch gears and then go look through, 40 pages of a PDF. That really slows you down. So if you can just get that answer and then click a button and see that it's right, that's nice.
Yeah, well, not missing, and I think that goes back to your point on the rework thing, because rework is one of those things that happens, I find, when it's that miscommunication level between GC and sub. Sub had an old set of prints, or sub had, didn't have didn't have those said specifications somehow, or says they didn't, and they've done something now, and it looks like, well, that's not going to work. We need to redo this, or you missed this by an inch. Why is that? These are the drawings that we have. That's not the right set of drawings. Well, why not? Why didn't you get me a new set of drawings? Well, maybe the communication level one there. Obviously, uh, being notified or being up to date on the latest information, being able to find it quickly is a huge help out in the field. So on that issue, I agree with you. I think when you start talking about what will help construction, like what's going to help it make a better profit, or what's going to help it stay within its margin now. Rework, change orders, getting to an RFI, trying to figure out how to reduce that length of time between the time you submitted the RFI and the time you get it back, to where there's an actual answer in front of you. And I think
Hmm.
that's a huge thing too. The RFI response time, because I always found that was, it would have been really helpful if I would have had some answers. It didn't take me 3 weeks to get something back from an engineer or something, because then I would have had, the correct materials ordered or in place, maybe in time to get things
Well, I
done.
think what you could expect AI to be able to do isn't to approve a submittal, but knock out ones that are obviously wrong. So, and that's, you know what, if it knocks out, if it allows 50% to get that aren't right to get sent back, that saves everybody a lot of time, and it probably makes the AE a little bit, more responsive if they know that there's less likelihood that they're catching pretty obvious mistakes that may have made it through, because I'm sure it never happens, but I have heard once in a while that it's junior people on both sides that are looking at these things that may or may not know everything and may or may not catch everything. So if you can, there's a trust thing in here that AI might be able to help, not so much because it itself is trustworthy, as it allows people to have more time to do their job a little bit more, with a little bit more attention focus to it, because it's knocked out the stuff that someone would have caught, but it would have taken them an hour to find. So there's a little bit of that, and that's just process improvement. I think I could go back to something we said earlier. There's another thing that I think is wrong, is unhelpful here, and that is there have been moments when entire industries have been changed by technology, and we look back and think it was faster than it was. So when we're in the middle of what looks like a change, we expect it to be way quicker than it ever was in the past. And it's already pretty darn quick. The progress of the underlying technology in AI is faster than anything I've ever seen. And I've been in technology for 30 years. I was at Sony when broadband was coming. Well, everybody looks back and they don't remember. I was at AOL actually in 2006. We were still selling dial-up. In 2005, 2004, we had 30 million people on dial-up. It's 20 years ago. I mean, that's not that long ago. And nobody remembers that most of the world was on dial-up that recently. The reason I bring that up is, and it took about a decade for everybody to fully get on broadband, which is insane if you think about it, because the technology then wasn't that far off from where it is now. Everything's a cable modem. So I think there's an expectation that someone's going to get a killer app, a term which thankfully we don't hear quite so often, and it's going to sweep through and change construction, and we're all going to look back in 6 months and say, how did we ever live? And I think nothing works like that. What you're seeing is lots of little improvements as software gets better and the AI models get a little better, and people say, oh, I can do something with that. It's going to make this set of features better than it was. But it's incremental. And I'm glad that it's incremental, because then you're also not asking people to change the way they've spent 20 years doing something too much. You're saying, hey, the thing you did before, you can do like it was, but now there's a tool that isn't so hard to use, and we've gone out of our way to make the user interface easy for you. So you're doing the same thing, you're just skipping some manual steps, and at the end you can still check it. I think that's more likely, and that's what we're in the middle of seeing.
Now, there are some companies out there that are, they're going to be behind the 8 ball here. We do need to bring people out of the Stone Age a little bit. We got to get them off of paper processes, because they will need to have this technology to, keep them in the game. What do you think about that? Is that right, wrong, indifferent? I mean, I'm not talking
I,
about medium-sized to larger-sized
right,
companies that may have some antiquated or legacy type
right.
systems.
It's funny how companies have more than one way to compete, and more than one way that they can be really good or be very profitable or just very successful generally. And process and technology is often part of that, but it isn't the only part of that. Relationships can give people a long lead time. And you're talking about 3-year projects or whatever it is. So they've just that gives
Mm-hmm.
people a lot of buffer time. I think that there's areas where anyone can make pretty easy gains quickly, and sales, marketing, and pursuit are a good place to start, because there's no contract that gets causes them a bunch of money if if an email goes out that's wrong, and a human's going to look at it. It's easier to adopt in there, and they're usually way understaffed. because it's viewed as an expense very often. So there's a lot fewer people than there might be on a, on a project team actually, building something up. So I think that staff functions are often a good place to start with things that are heavy product, like whose promise is productivity. And you can learn a lot by doing that. Like they can be, for lack of a better word, the guinea pig and say, hey, let's get marketing on this and have them start writing, blog posts and all the other things and get to know it a little bit. And then come back to us in 6 months and tell us where they thought it was useful and what was their experience. So as opposed to saying to a project manager and say, I want you to start using AI for some, I don't know, for drawing review, right? Like that's tough. That's
Yeah.
tough. Because what winds up happening, and I hear this a lot, is people too often think that the tool is going to do it all for them. Like over and over again, I hear people say, well, I still had to go do it myself. And that's partly because people are pitching it the wrong way, in my view. They're saying this will do it for you. No, it won't. What it'll
Yeah. Yeah.
do is 80%, maybe it'll do 80% of the easy stuff, and you had to go and catch the final 20. You still spent a lot less time doing that thing than you otherwise would have. Or instead of only checking something once a day, you can get updates 2 or 3 times a day, whatever it is. Like the point is, there's two things that I think AI can help with. And I'll get back to your question about being left behind. One of them is spending less time on something, right? That's kind of more productivity, for lack of a better word. There's still a human checking, so you have to make sure that you're covered on the risk side. The other interesting thing, though, is doing something more that you could never pay people to do, whether it's reviewing documents or going through the photos of things and so on. And it may not be perfect, but it's giving you updates that are incomplete but are not nothing either, right?
Right.
Especially if you pointed at stuff that's kind of easy or obvious. Your point about being left behind, the reason I launched my kind of response thing, there's a lot of ways to compete, is I think people should be not worried about it, but they should be clear-headed about why they're winning. And if being able to, if price is part of why they're, I mean, it's never not part of the story, but are you winning on price alone? In which case you should look at AI and see how it can cut cost out of your project delivery. If you're winning because you're really good at building hospitals and you've got great relationships with the big hospital groups, by all means, you're probably a big enough company that you can have a skunkworks that's over there learning about AI and trying things out, while the people that are actually pulling buildings out of the ground are only taking on things that have been really vetted and someone's giving them good training and so on. So I think, that's strategy. It's something that honestly professional services businesses like construction are frequently not as good at as they think they are, compared to like consumer goods where it's two sugar waters. You get really good at strategy when you have no other basis of competition. Whereas, professional services, often there's a lot of ways to compete, and you may or may not be employing a lot of strategy. But my point is, I think you look at how you compete and say, if efficiency and ultimately cost are part of that, or speed for that matter, maybe AI is going to help us, but it isn't going to transform the business. It's going not in the short term for sure, but it might do things like carve up 1% off of our costs, which over the course of $1 billion business is worth having, right? And it allows you to comfortably undercut someone by 1%. That's a lot, especially for
Right.
a bigger project. Now, I think 1% is even a lot, but the point I'm making is, I think the people need to ground it not in the technology and what the technology can do. They need to ground it in how they compete and how they're successful as a business. And does it fit into that, or could it fit into that? And maybe
Mhm.
make that the question that you ask people that are out there making big promises about some of the really hard stuff like scheduling and design and so on, is I need you to prove to me that this is going to be reliably do a better job.
In that kind of vein, if there were if there is emerging tech, if you were to say, hey, the emerging tech that's important for you right now, that's important for construction, what do you think that would be? Is it more focus on, I mean, BIM's been around a long time, but it gets more and more developed, and then you get the VDC technologies and all that kind of stuff. Is it something like that that's a better thing to focus on? What do you think?
I think that interesting. Back to your point about data, one of the reasons why data is harder for construction than it might be somewhere else is it's hard to classify things because there's no standard. Inside of a spec, there's a kind of a standard of master format and all that, but beyond that, it's really tough to pull items and put them somewhere in a way that another contractor or a subcontractor would know what you mean. I think what you're going to see is the emergence, and people are closing in on this, the emergence of ways where I can take, the documents from any project, whether that's a model or whether that's a PDF or whatever, and pull it apart and turn it into a database. That's when I think BIM becomes an actual information model instead of, excuse me, just the geometry, which is most of what I see people doing. Is it's
Mhm.
mostly the shapes and all that. I think it was, people had hoped that BIM, and if you read a BIM book, they'll often tell you it's more than just the model. Okay, in theory, trying to marry all of the data that's in a spec with what's in the model, no one's been able to do, because you can't decompose a spec well enough to put pieces of it into a model. Does that make sense? And
Right.
once you're able to do that, I think it unlocks an awful lot of things that you could have AI do, or just software do.
So is this
So
the same kind of hype though that we're hearing on I say the word hype again, but is this the same kind of thing we're hearing about 4D modeling? That whole is that what they're talking about? That whole how it gets built as well as what it gets built with and the
I
timeline?
yeah, I'm kind of talking about something different, but the two would come together in the same thing. What I'm saying right now is that right now the model doesn't have most of the data of what's in the spec. It's not supposed to at the moment, but I think the vision of BIM was that it would be one data set that has both the geometry and all of the requirements that would be in the spec in one place. And no one's found a way to do that in a way that's useful. I know people have taken shots at it and so on. I think that some of that is because it's really hard to pull apart a spec. So you're not just attaching the whole 6 pages or 12 pages over and over and over again. Imagine doing that with concrete, which is like everywhere. So,
Right.
so I guess what I would say to your question, I think so. What I was getting at is, I think we as an industry are getting way better at doing things with data other than just passing PDFs around. I think we're getting way, way better. And some companies are ahead of others in this. Some have spent a lot of time and effort. Suffolk they're the only one I know that has a chief data officer. Like, that's pretty cool.
Mhm.
I know DPR has got a whole team of people. In fact, when I was at CSI, they were the only contractor that would send people to some of the CSI. They would A lot of them would go to events, but would go to kind of webinars and so on. So some of these contractors are really trying hard to turn unstructured kind of documents into data you can do things with, and that makes it much more likely that software and AI-enabled software can do things. For the moment, I have not seen, now mind you, I'm in a pretty document heavy part of the industry, so there's going to be stuff I see less of. But I think that on the design side and on the 3D side, I don't see AI doing things right now, as much as I do on the document side, because documents are just easier.
Mhm.
It's words that are flat, right? And they're words that mean independently means it's just easier to do stuff with. So I think you're seeing, whether it's contract review, which is part AI and part just software. In our case, specifications. There's a bunch of stuff we can do. Um, it's a smaller problem. One of the things I point out is, be wary of when somebody is promising a really big problem will get solved by AI or software, right? Like, we'll look at your entire schedule and do big things with it. I think that sort of a promise is difficult, because the problem you're solving is so big, that
Mhm.
because you're not just asking about a sequence of things, you're asking about what those things and how they interact with each other, and you're also asking how they interact with the world and how mistakes have an impact and all those other things. There's a reason schedulers are so specialized. It's hard, really hard. So I
Right.
think that right now, you're better off focusing on problems that are small and problems that are not at the risky part of the business, and learning from that. And to the point you made before, get into it, and while it develops, so that you've got some sense of it when it gets a little bit more sophisticated. But I have a feeling we're going to find it takes longer than people think. I have a feeling it's going to show up doing things that maybe we didn't expect it to. I think you're going to see it in offsite construction before you see it on any job sites, for the obvious reason: it's a simpler environment, it's a
Mm.
smaller problem. I just finished my comment with this. I remember in 2018, everyone thought that in 2019 we were going to have self-driving cars on every road. I went to this great, remember that? And people were buying like cars that had level 5, they called it, which they still call it that, but there is no level 5, and it's, you know, it's 5, 6 years on. There was a guy who is the CEO of a company called Scale AI. All they do is data for AI companies. So he really understood the data side of building a model. And he said, look, I don't see this before 2026, 2027. And he said this back then. Everyone's like, what are you talking about? My car says it can do it. It just needs Congress. And his point was, as you need to get more and more accurate, the amount of data you need starts to scale to a point where it's just out of control. And we're nowhere near, back then, we were nowhere near the amount of data he thought we would probably need. And he was pretty good at this. And it turned out he was right. You know, and it didn't turn out to work like we thought. And if you'd ask somebody in 2012, we're going to automate some of driving, would your first thought have been, well, it's obviously going to be the highway? No. I would have said, no, it's going to be parking the car or driving on side streets because you're slower. Turns out that, and we didn't know this until they tried to build it, that it's a lot easier to drive on the highway because it's a constant speed. People are moving towards each other in a very predictable way. You know what I mean? And it turned out they were able to do that in 2017 or whenever it was. So you're going to find the same thing with AI, is that as people really build things and as project teams make the decision to use it or not, you're going to find that it helps things that maybe you didn't think, and it really doesn't help for things that we thought it might.
Interesting stuff. Man, I appreciate your time today. And it seems like it went really, really fast. Just
This is
talking
great.
about this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah,
But
it's good to deflate things a little bit. I appreciate you doing that. I think people saying this is a real technology, just like mobile was, and just like mobile, it's going to take longer than we think. And when it does, it'll change some of how we do things, and it won't change others.
yeah, I think, my intent with doing, all of this is to give some real, I don't know, levity. I want some truth to some things. I want to really take a hard look at it and go, is that really the case? Or are we just kind of, we're pumping up something that, yeah, at some point in time is going to be awesome. It'll do some really fantastic things. But I think, like you said, things take a lot longer than most people think, right? It's like becoming a country artist. Everybody says you're an overnight sensation, but it took you 10 years to get there,
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
So
That's right. Yeah, we're definitely there.
yeah, we're definitely there. Well, Hugh, thank you so much. And if you don't mind, I'll reach back out to you. Like I said, I like to continue these conversations, and maybe in a couple months we can sit back down, talk again, and kind of see what's happening for you in 2025.
Cool. I'll look forward to it. Thanks for having me. It's been an
All
honor.
right.